Good evening. Um, Please turn to Psalms 37, verses 1 through 6, and we'll be taking a closer look at verses 3 and 4. And I've noticed something, that since being back home, it's brought back a wave of emotions that never seemed to come when I just visited home on break. And I found myself getting caught up with the affairs of the world, and that often makes me reflect on what I call my second coming to Jesus moment. You see, although I have confidence that I was still saved then, I didn't really put much faith in God for my daily life. I trusted Him for my eternal destiny, but I didn't care to involve Him in my temporal, my earthly destiny. And as I continued to pursue my goals for my life here on earth, I watched as one by one they came crumbling down. And finally, when I had nothing left, I realized that God would provide it. He would provide my goals. He would provide my joy and my hope. All the Sunday school lessons that I had always learned about God being our joy, and I never really made it part of me. And that's when I was reminded. I had to realize an important fact that I had ignored for so much of my life. And that is this: every Christian can live with joy through seeking God's will. That's every Christian can live with joy through seeking God's will. The logical question that follows that is, well then, how do we seek God's will? We'll seek God's will by adhering to 4 commands that we find in verses 3 and 4. Let's read those. Starting back at verse 1 to get a little bit of context. Do not fret because of evildoers. Do not be envious toward wrongdoers, for they will quickly wither like the grass and fade like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust also in Him, and He will do it. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light, and your judgment as the noonday. Now I'm reading out of the NASB, and particularly in verse 4, there's a lot of difference in the translations, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I want you to take a quick look at the structure here, because we see in some Bibles they have sectioned off in verse groups of 2 for the first 6 verses. 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6. And they all seem to have a combination of a command and a promise following that command. We're going to take a look at that structure, a very close look at that structure in verses 3 and 4. We find 4 commands and 1 promise. And before we dive into this, I want to ask you a question. I want you to think on this and remember it, because we'll get back to it at the end. But what line most resonates with you? What line sticks out in your mind the most? Now, think about this a little bit and remember it, because we'll get back to it in the end. Now, in these verses, our 4 commands that we've been given are to trust God, do good, dwell and cultivate, and delight yourself in the Lord. Our promise is at the end of verse 4 is to be given the desires of our heart. The first command in verse 3 is that we read to trust in the Lord. Now, I really would like to dig deep into the Hebrew meaning and the nuances of this word. And what it really means is to trust. Yeah, so that aside, let's get on to the practical application. It's so simple, and that we have a tendency to glance over it and think, oh yeah, trust in God and all that stuff, yada, 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 where's the hard stuff? But if it were really that simple, wouldn't we be doing it more? If it were really that simple, would David have had to put this in the psalm? No. See, I get to see real trust in the lives of the men in my prayer groups. That even when their life is crashing down and everything's falling apart around them, and They have things that would make other men just cry out in fear and desperation. I see them calm in the storm. I see that they live in peace. Sure, they work at it. They have their earthly solutions to it, but they still trust God that even though their solutions are uncertain, they're calm about it. And still yet, when things are going well in their lives, and something small needs a solution, and maybe they know it, maybe they don't know how to get that solution, they have trust in God. They have faith that He'll bring about a good and ending for them. You see, so often it's easy to trust God with the big things. In the same way that we'll pray to Him when we need help out of a hurricane, we'll pray and we'll have faith in Him that He'll solve our big problems. But how much do we really trust Him even to solve the little things? How often, when those little things come up, those little issues, maybe a car repair or a small bill that has to get paid and we don't quite know where the money is, or if money's starting to run low and maybe we'll make it, maybe we won't, especially those times. It's so uncertain. It's so easy for us to get self-reliant on the small issues and forget that God cares about those too. So I ask you, how often do we purposely say to God, Father, I trust you to provide for my needs in this solution? I challenge you that in the little things in your life, especially the little things, the big things will come naturally to us. But take a moment in your life and intentionally place trust in God instead of relying completely on earthly provisions and earthly plans from our sinful, tainted minds. Certainly do not forsake the earthly effort, but have the trust in God that if/when our own earthly efforts fail, that God will provide for us. The second command is to do good. Much like the first one, there's not much nuance to the Hebrew. Now, notice, though, what popped out to me was that we're not given a detailed list of how to accomplish the good. One could say that because it's originally intended for the Israelites and they had the law, that was their list of how to do the good. But a majority of the law only says what not to do, what not is good, and how to dispense justice when that evil is done. But there's so much more to good than that. The verse doesn't just say not to do evil, but it says to do the good. Really, so often we think of things that could easily count as good. When we think of things that could count as good, they're things that show love for someone else and a duty to righteousness. If we see someone in need, isn't it the good thing to do to help them out in some way? Not necessarily to provide them with all their needs, lest they become dependent, but to do good and help them out in one way or another. If we see a robbery, isn't it the good thing to do to try to stop it or to help the police to bring about justice? In these examples, we see a combination of love for the other individual, where we provide for their needs. We care about the shop owner who just got robbed, and a loyalty to righteousness, where we don't let that person become dependent on us, and we don't love the robber so much that we let him get away. In a small way, when we do the good things, we're showing God's character through us. And the challenge I issue for us for this command is that as you go about your day, think through more and more of your life decisions and ask yourself these questions. Does this choice show love for the other person? Does it uphold righteousness? And does it show God's character through us? I think a great place for us to start with this would be our mundane, everyday choices that we make daily. These choices can be easiest for us to change if they don't show God's love. They don't do these things, and they can still have a great impact. And if we start with the little things, the bigger things will follow. And as we continue to do this, as we make more and more of our choices based on these questions, it will become permeated. It'll permeate down into every part of our life and begin to work in our heart, especially if we begin with our heart. The third command is to dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. That's what it says in the NASB. Of course, other versions have far different translations. The NIV says to enjoy safe pasture. King James says, verily thou shalt be fed. The Amplified Bible says, feed securely on his faithfulness. I kind of like that one. But looking at the Hebrew through Blue Letter Bible, two words are used in this. One is ra'ah, which is a verb translated as to feed, to shepherd, to be the pastor. It's a verb conveying those things. It's very often used about David and what he's doing with his sheep. It's sometimes used for us as God is feeding us. The second word is emunah, which means faithfulness, truth, or faithfully. So the idea with this command is to live our lives, to dwell where God places us in the land. And while we are doing that, we are to faithfully be fed by God as our shepherd. So let's take a quick look at what the shepherd does. The shepherd, he provides. He provides food. He guides them to their grazing pastures. He provides safety. He wards off the predators who would kill and devour them. And then he heals and provides for their health. He cares deeply for them. He is their caretaker. So how is God to be our shepherd? How can we let God be our shepherd? How can we make God our shepherd? In Matthew 6, Jesus talks about how God will provide for our earthly needs, including food and dress. Beyond that, though, and deeper than that, God has provided us with the Bible to be our spiritual food. He leads us in our lives to places and times where we can grow in Him and then help others to grow. Those would be our pastors. He's set strategies for our defense against sin and the devil. And most importantly, He provided Jesus to heal us from our sins and He nurtures our spiritual health so that we can know more of Him. The challenge for us in this command that I issue to all of us is similar to the challenge from the first command to trust in the Lord. It's simply put and said, but is God your shepherd? It's an interesting thing that the word ra'ah is also used in one of the specific names for God, Jehovah Ra'ah, the Lord my shepherd. So is He your shepherd? Or are you your own shepherd? Do you ask Him? Do you seek where He wants you to go? Or do you decide for yourself like I was doing? Do you rely completely on yourself to provide your own needs? Or do you have faith that even when you fail, God will provide? Can you rest easy in that? Moving on to verse 4. The first line in verse 4 contains our final command that is given in these verses. Let's take a moment to reread that. Verses 3 and 4. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. Then here it is, the fourth one. Delight yourself in the Lord. And our promise, He will give you the desires of your heart. Now, the final command, as we just read, is to delight in the Lord. When I began thinking of how I can somehow convey this meaning to us and what it even means to delight yourself in the Lord, my mind instantly went to the story of Horatio G. Spafford and the origin of the hymn, It Is Well With My Soul. As you may know, Horatio's life is a recurring sequence of great joys followed by incredible tragedy. He had married a wonderful woman and was raising a great Christian family. And he had also experienced great professional success. He had become the landowner of much property in Chicago. But then in 1870, his 4-year-old son died suddenly of scarlet fever. A year later, the Great Chicago Fire destroyed so much of his property and much of the lives of everyone around them. But then, worse yet, 2 years later, him and his family were going on a vacation to England to listen to a preacher. And he had to stay back for work, but he sent his wife and his daughters ahead of him. While they were on their way across the Atlantic, there was a shipwreck. His wife was in the wreck, and she was saved, but his daughters were not. When she returned to England, she sent him a telegram that included the words, "Saved alone." So in the span of 4 years, Horatio had lost all of his children and suffered incredible professional loss. And yet, while he was traveling across the Atlantic Ocean to meet up with his wife and to mourn together, as he was passing, it is reported that as he was passing the area where the shipwreck happened and his daughters had perished, he began to write the famous hymn, "It is well with my soul." Truly, he was distraught and incredibly filled with grief. Yet in this grief, inside of him was met with love and trust in God. He knew that through all the loss he had suffered, that God was still sovereign, that he was in control, and that God still cared for him. And that's what it looks like to delight in the Lord. It's easy for us to say that we're delighting in God when all of our needs are at our fingertips, and we're about to marry the woman of our dreams, when everything is peaches and cream and roses in our life. But a much truer sense of delight in the Lord comes when we lose our job, when our spouse or our parents die, when we feel like we have nothing left and death would become a sweet escape from our troubles. During those times, is God enough for us to find our delight? These commands to trust, to do good, to dwell and cultivate, to dwell and be shepherded, are followed by the promise. He will give you, and to delight. There's the fourth one, sorry. Are followed by the promise. He will give you the desires of your heart. Now, many health and wealth preachers love to harp on this section of the verse because it is just health and wealth. Gold when you take it out of context. But when we look at the promise with the wrong mindset, we can begin to put the cart before the ox. The verse isn't phrased that God will give you the desires of your heart, and that will let you delight in the Lord. Instead, when these 4 commands are met, the promise will be delivered. And the reality of the situation is that when we pursue these commands, it is us that will change. Not so much whether or not our Christmas list is filled up and our desires of our earthly hearts are filled, but it's our hearts that will change. These commands run far deeper than just our surface level appearance or decisions. These commands reach down to our hearts, which is really the heart of the situation. As these commands begin to affect more and more our hearts will change and become more and more in line with God. And when our hearts are aligned with God, His desires will become our desires. Remember my question from the beginning. What line in these 2 verses resonates with you the most? The main answer I want you to consider with yourselves is whether or not it was the last line. Was it God will give you the desires of your heart? Or was it one of the 4 commands that we talked about, to trust, to do good, to dwell, and to delight? Was it one of those 4 or the promise line? If it was one of the command verses, then it's probably because that is the challenge that you see yourself weakest in. But if you read these verses and your mind fixated on, He shall give you the desires of your heart, then it's really a commentary on where your heart lies now. It doesn't mean that you aren't saved by any means, but I encourage you to pray and to seek discipleship, to find the truth about why you feel like this. Surely it's a natural thing to feel excited about our desires being met, but is that still where your mind is at? Sorry. If you'll recall, my position for today was that Christians can live with joy by seeking God's will. We find part of God's will through the commands in these verses to trust in the Lord. Are we purposely putting our trust in God to provide for our needs? To do good? Do our choices show love for others and a desire for righteousness? To dwell and cultivate faithfulness? Or, to combine translations, to dwell and be shepherded by God? Is the Lord my shepherd, or am I my own shepherd? Fourth, to delight in the Lord. Is God enough for our delight when we have everything? And is he still that when everything else is gone? We find God's will through the commands in this verse, and we find our joy through the promise that he will give us the desires of our hearts. And when we seek to fulfill these commands in our heart's desires change into God's desires. I hope you all are doing well. I know this has been certainly a struggle for me. How much more so for everyone else? I wish you well. I pray for you and I think about you. Stay healthy.